Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining us at www.sonic-cinema.com. This year I turned 40 years old, and to commemorate the occasion, I wanted to do a special podcast where the list is called 40 Movies That Have Shaped My 40 Years. They're not necessarily the greatest films I've ever seen, they're not necessarily the best films I've ever seen, although there is a nice mix of both of them in there. Um, they're basically the movies that I think have had the strongest impact on me over the past 40 years. And it's a pretty diverse list. It's a pretty surprising list in some cases. In a lot of cases, though, not so much if you're familiar with me and my taste in movies over the years. So let's go ahead and begin the 40 movies that have shaped my 40 years. Being a child born in 1977, I think it would be remiss if I did not include Star Wars Episode 4 New Hope, George Lucas's original Star Wars film that launched the phenomenon that we are still seeing today with The Last Jedi. And it's probably the most obvious choice on this list because of the fact that if you know me, you know how much of a Star Wars fan I am, how much I love Star Wars, how much it means to me. The thing that I think separates A New Hope from the other films, and I will concede that I do think Empire as a whole is probably a better film, but I think A New Hope resonates stronger with me because of the fact that it deal is the quintessential hero's journey, and with Luke Skywalker played by Mark Hamill. I mean, that's something that really resonates with me strongly. It resonated with me when I was a kid. It resonates with me now. And just seeing the way that character transitions from film to film and the possibilities of what we're going to be seeing with the character in The Last Jedi coming out later this year has me truly excited to see what is going to happen with this franchise in the future, and in particular, the characters that I grew up knowing and loving. And so the first film on here's the most obvious one. It is Star Wars Episode 4 New Hope. We're going to fast forward a few years to 1982's E.T. the Extraterrestrial by Steven Spielberg. Another somewhat obvious choice, I think. If you ask most kids in my generation, I think they would certainly agree that this was one of the movies that shaped their childhoods and really they enjoyed probably more than some of the other movies that came out in the 80s for us. For me, I think the film still resonates with me because of the fact that the bond, first and foremost, between Elliot, played by Henry Thomas, and E.T. is so powerful and so strong. And the idea that Elliot was this kid that he was having a hard time finding his place after his parents divorced. And I think that's not that my parents did not get divorced, but I think after I moved to Georgia with them in 1988, I think that part of the story probably resonated with me pretty strongly. Um, as did the next film on this list, which I'll get to shortly. But E.T. is probably one of the perfect family films, not necessarily including Disney in there, but even if you include Disney, I think it's probably one of the closest family films to being truly perfect as far as filmmaking, as far as the way the characters interact, as far as the way the story resonates. It's just flawless filmmaking by Spielberg. It's still one of his greatest films. So it's E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Up next is The Karate Kid from the director of Rocky, starring Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita. This is another film that, sort of like E.T., I think resonated with me a lot when we moved to Georgia, much like Daniel moves out with his mother for work. I moved down here with my parents for work, and I had a hard time fitting in. And I think this film really resonated with me in that respect. Um, and I did take up karate for a brief instance, inspired by this film. I didn't get very far, but it was something I did enjoy, and I did get a lot out of it at the time, even though I didn't really continue it too much. Um, so the next film on this list, and I will admit, probably of all of the films on here, I will admit, like, I think my first real movie crush, more than anything, was probably Elizabeth Shue's character in this movie. Um, and this movie, in addition to that, I think, and the other things I mentioned earlier, I think one of the important things about this movie, for me personally, is that uh, it's the film that probably solidified my appreciation for what I call the underdog sports movie. That is probably one of my guilty pleasure genres in cinema, and it still gets me every time now. And the Karate Kid, I think, really put that into my DNA pretty early on. Um, so number 3 on this list is the Karate Kid. Number 4 is another movie. All of these first few movies are movies that I think most people in my generation would say, yes, absolutely, this is a movie that I grew up loving. Um, this one is Richard Donner's The Goonies, and I think the thing I like about it is that is an action adventure, kind of like Star Wars, but for kids. And it's got some serious moments. It's got some serious adult topics, which I like, and it doesn't necessarily shy away from them. But at the same time, it's ultimately a kid's adventure, and I think that's the thing that I really enjoyed about it more than anything when I was growing up. I mean, now it's nice and nostalgic, and it's really got entertaining characters. It's got entertaining story, entertaining, just entertaining aspects of it all in general. The humor, the adventure, the suspense, the action. It's just a really well done movie. It's one of the finer examples, I think, of Richard Donner's value as a filmmaker and why I think he's one of the more underrated directors of his generation. Um, but The Goonies is something that, in sort of the same way of E.T. and The Cry Kid, it's something I think that spoke to me as far as being a relatively shy kid, but wanting to have more of a life to a certain extent than I did, especially when it was when we moved down to Georgia. Um, and I think The Goonies really spoke to me about that, as well as when I would get involved with Scouts later. I think just the adventure aspect of that was fun. So, number 4 on this list is Richard Donner's The Goonies. The next 2 films on this list, I have to give thanks to my mother, Victoria Scuttle, for introducing me to at a relatively young age. And one thing you'll notice very early on, those first 4 movies were all in chronological order because, I mean, that's basically how I saw them. But you'll notice, especially as the list goes on and I start to go into the movies that I have really resonated with me before, that came out before I was born, I'm approximating as close to the time frame, the sort of order that I saw the movies in as I can, not necessarily the year that they came out. And that's something you'll notice right away with these next 2 choices, because they both predate when I was born. And there are movies that my mother turned me on to, and there are movies that I still absolutely love and enjoy now. They're both comedies. The first one is Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein, which my mother and I think, have very much soaked so much into our DNA that we can, to a certain extent, we can predict what lines are coming up next. And it's Young Frankenstein is probably one of the greatest comedies I've ever seen. Um, it it's not necessarily in the top five, but maybe it's in the top 10. Just Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder's affection for the Frankenstein movies and the way that they poke fun at them. The performances by Wilder, Madeline Kahn, Terry Garr, Marty Feldman, Peter Boyle, Cloris Leachman, everybody in this movie is just absolutely flawless and hilarious. And when I finally saw the James Whale Frankenstein movies, Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, it grew my appreciation for what Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder were able to do in this movie grew because I finally was able to understand just how closely they mirrored the Frankenstein story in general and just how much fun they were having at the expense of movies that are absolutely fantastic. And James Whale made really entertaining Frankenstein movies. And just the affection that Young Frankenstein approaches its subject with, it's something you don't really see out of parody nowadays. And it's one of those things that Mel Brooks, especially with this and Blazing Saddles and some of his earlier parodies, uh, lost to a certain extent. I do enjoy Spaceballs, but I will definitely be the first to admit that is not on the same level as Young Frankenstein or Blazing Saddles. But it's one of those things where it's like you're definitely not going to see a movie like Frankenstein now. I think the closest anybody has really come recently is Scary Movie because of how much it mirrored the first Scream. But even that pales in comparisons to what Mel Brooks did in Young Frankenstein. The next film on here is another one that my mom introduced me to. It's also a comedy. That's her genre, her favorite genre. Mine is more science fiction, fantasy. Um, but Young Frankenstein and Frank Capra's adaptation of the off Broadway play Arsenic and Old Lace are two films that really sort of solidified some of my comedic sensibilities, some of the things that I enjoy in comedies. And especially Arsenic and Old Lace is a very dark comedy. If you don't know the premise to it, Cary Grant plays a reporter who gets married. He goes to tell the two older ladies who raised him and adopted him and raised him. And he finds out that they have actually been killing men, lonely old men with no family over the years, sort of as a service to, so that nobody's going to miss them. So it's like we're just going to kill them and bury them in the cellar. And that is the kernel of humor that drives the entire film. And it's very screwball. It's very dark comedy. It's very broad in terms of the performances, but the performances, especially by Cary Grant, Richard Massey, Peter Lorre, are just spot on and really funny. Their performances that I really enjoy. It's a movie that I continually enjoy. It's been a while since I've seen it, but when I saw it a few years ago with a friend of mine, it still holds up extremely well for me. And so that is Frank Capra's Arsenic and Old Lace. Next up, we've got a couple of films from 1987 that could not be more different. It's very surreal to think about the fact that these movies are 30 years old, but they're movies that I watched as a kid. One makes sense that I probably will have watched it. The other one, I could possibly wait a couple of years, but nonetheless, The Princess Bride by Rob Reiner, based on the book by William Goldman, is this was a late edition, and admittedly, I probably could put Rob Reiner's Stand By Me on here, and it would have made more sense. But and it's Stand By Me is a great film, but The Princess Bride is just it's sort of along the lines of Star Wars and the Goonies, where it's like it really hits it really ingrains into your memory the idea of what really good storytelling, really good adventure storytelling can be. And those three films really codified that for me, I think. The Princess Bride, it adds a great deal of humor, and it's a very funny movie, as you expect, with not only Rob Reiner directing, but also the cast with Christopher Guest, Mandy Patinkin, um, Carrie Elwes, Robin Wright, Billy Crystal, Carol Kane, Chris Sarandon, so many talented actors and so many well cast actors. I think that was the most important thing. Even Andre the Giant is really funny in this, and Wallace Shawn is terrific. Um, it's a movie that it's a quintessential fairy tale, and to a certain extent, I consider it a chick flick. But the fact of the matter is, it's like there's so much that's just really appealing on all levels. It surprised me when Entertainment Weekly considered this a cult movie like 10 years ago. I'm like, it's not a cult movie. It's a movie that is it's a movie that so many people love. It's a movie that it doesn't have a cult following. It's a genuine classic. It's along the lines of the Adventures of Robin Hood and those type of movies. And it's like, why how is this a cult classic? So many people love this movie for so many reasons. And I continue to love it. I love the music. I love the story. I love the way the story is told with the wrap around with Fred Savage and Peter Falk. I love the performances. I love the uh, sense of humor. I love the adventure. I just love every aspect of it. And so The Princess Bride was a natural choice for this. Up next is John McTiernan's Predator, and it's an R-rated movie, but I saw it when I think I was 10 years old. By that time, I had seen a couple of R-rated movies. Um, this one, I'm adding to go sort of acknowledge a period of time when I first started to watch R-rated horror movies. Because to a certain extent, Predator very much follows in the same line of A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th in terms of that slasher picking people off one by one. And it has that structure, but it's basically a science fiction action movie about an alien that has landed on Earth and is basically picking off a group of soldiers and mercenaries led by Arnold Schwarzenegger and Carl Weathers. Uh, it's probably the Predator's without doubt my favorite movie monster of all time. I just love the different types of powers it has. I love the way different ways that it can kill you. I love the fact that it can camouflage itself. I love the fact that it can sneak up on you and kill you that way. I love the mano a mano it has with Arnold Schwarzenegger at the end of the movie is one of my favorite action sequences and actually one of my favorite sequences, period, of all time. And this movie it does like I said it does carry a lot in common with the slasher movies of like your Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, but one of the things I like is that there's serious even though Arnold Schwarzenegger's the star in this, I do feel like there's a genuine sense that maybe he will not come out of this alive. And that's one of the things that I think I enjoy most about this movie is the fact that there is a sense of doubt as far as whether Arnold will survive in that. So the next film, so that is John McTiernan's Predator. We're gonna fast forward a few more years and go to Rob Reiner's A Few Good Men, which is the first serious sort of adult movie I have on this list. And I mean, I think it was the drama, serious movie, the first one that really resonated with me. And a lot of that had to do with the circumstances in which I saw it. Um, I saw it with my parents and my grandfather shortly after Christmas. My grandfather was visiting us, and for Christmas, and we went to go see it. And it's a movie that I really enjoyed. I still enjoy it. I watched it a few months ago. It's still a damn good, serious movie. It's got great performances by Tom Cruise, Demi Moore, Jack Nicholson, so many others. But one of the things that really stood out when we watched it is um, my grandfather was having a difficult time figuring out, well, if Jack Nicholson's character and Kiefer Sutherland's character were ultimately responsible for the death of Santiago in that movie, why were Dawson Downey dishonorably discharged, and why did they still get in trouble? And the whole point of it, of course, is the fact that it's like, well, they're supposed to fight for people who aren't able to fight for themselves, and that includes somebody like Santiago. And that was in one of the first times where I think there was a really interesting um, discussion that I remember having with my family about the basic morality of instilled in a film. I mean, I think that's one of the first times it really jumped out at me, and it's we all loved it, and we ended up watching it every Christmas up until the time that my grandfather passed away in 2000, when we didn't watch it anymore. So that was an interesting experience to have that type of discussion about that type of movie. And it was probably the first time. This was just when I was starting to really. A Few Good Men was around the time that I started to really go into movies on a regular basis. It would be a couple of years later when I really started to watch movies critically and start watching movies from an analytical standpoint more intensely. But A Few Good Men was, I think, one of the first examples of a movie that there was real discussion about beyond, oh, well, it was good, it was bad, and it's like, what about it was significant? I mean, that was one of the, and A Few Good Men did that, and that's, so in a way, that's one of the first movies that really made me think about the the morality of a movie and sort of what a movie is saying, and that's something that doesn't necessarily happen all the time. Next up is another Steven Spielberg film, but it is definitely it is without doubt his best film. It is Schindler's List. Um, to a certain extent, I kind of wanted to put Jurassic Park on here too, but Schindler's List is significant for a lot of reasons. Apart from the fact that it's just a phenomenal film, um, the interesting thing about it, this was Schindler's List was where I really started to think about really follow movies, follow the Oscars, and all that stuff. And the lead up to Schindler's List was a big part of that. Seeing Schindler's List was a big part of that. Um, the thing about Schindler's List is, and it's interesting because even though I saw it when it first came out in Georgia, it wasn't until a few years later, and I thought it was amazing when it first came out. It was a fantastic movie. It was a great movie when it first came out. the emotional impact of the film that the film had on me didn't really connect until I saw it on network TV a few years later when they first ran it on network TV with very little interruptions and all that stuff. And I was in a lot of it had to do with the fact that I just wasn't mature enough as an individual to appreciate the weight of the story of Oscar Schindler and the Holocaust. And I was looking at the film from a critical standpoint. I wasn't looking at the story from an emotional standpoint. So, and I had seen it a couple of years in between my first time seeing it, my one time seeing it in theaters, and then on network. But it was alone in my dorm room watching it on network TV and just having that scene, that setting, and the film just wrecked me. Emotionally speaking, the film just wrecked me. And I just like the weight of the story for the hit me, I think, for the first time. And it was the turning point. It was kind of a turning point in the way I looked at films, but also in the way that I looked at that in particular film. And Schindler's List is just an unforgettable film. I mean, it's considered Spielberg's best because it, quite frankly, is. I mean, he's made so many great films over the years, but Schindler's List is the finest piece of storytelling he's ever done, quite frankly. And it just is unforgettable as an experience. Once you really are able to, once you're mature enough to give your heart over to the film, that's when it really clicks with you, and really the wave of emotion that that film brought out of people when they saw it in theaters really sticks with you. And the 10th film on this list is Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. Continuing on with we've got a trio of 1994 films coming up. The first one is Alex Proyas's The Crow, which for a long time was my favorite movie of all time. Still in the top 3 to 5 movies of all time for me, favorites wise. Starring the late Brandon Lee, based on James O'Barr's graphic novel. This is a movie, and one of the things I didn't mention with Predator that I should have is the fact that Predator was a movie that I saw based on what other people were telling me about the movie. They said they saw it, they really liked it, that I should see it. So that's how I ended up seeing it. The Crow was kind of the same way. A few friends of mine, friends and family of mine had seen it, they really liked it. I had bought the soundtrack, the song soundtrack, and loved it. I listened to it as much as I could over the summer. I didn't actually see the film until it came out in May, but I didn't actually see the film until the last day it was in discount theaters nearby before I had band practice one day. So I saw it at the discount theater. It ended up being the last day it was in theaters. And I was immediately taken by the film. I was immediately taken by the imagery, the performances, just everything about the film just resonated with me incredibly. And so when I saw it when it came out in video, I rented it as much as I could. As soon as I saw a copy available, I bought it. And I believe I did officially run a VHS tape of that movie into the ground. And it was my favorite movie of all time for a long time. Not because I was necessarily like into gothic type movies or anything like that. I really wasn't. It just resonated with me on an emotional level that that type of movie hadn't really resonated with me before. And Brandon Lee in the movie is was amazing. It's a shame that that ended up being his most famous movie as well as his best movie, um, and his last movie. So Alex Proyas's The Crow starts off our trio of 1994 films. The second one is Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, which, like The Crow, like Predators, another movie that friends had to tell me that they enjoyed it in order for me to get to see it. Now, The Crow and Predator, I was kind of interested in beforehand. Pulp Fiction, I'll be honest, the trailer did not excite me at all. I was not looking forward to it. I didn't understand what that movie was going to be. I hadn't seen Reservoir Dogs. I didn't see it until after I saw Pulp Fiction. I did. It's like The Crow. I listened to the soundtrack. My friend Ron let me borrow the soundtrack. I made a copy of it, and I started listening to it over the Christmas break. One time, my mother and when it was out, my mother and I went to go see it, and it was probably the most laughs I ever had watching the movie. Watching a movie in theaters at that time, it was just the dark comedic streak of that movie has stayed with me for all time, and it's a movie that's nothing but fun, but it's also deeply serious in some of its morality, and that's one of the things that strikes me as interesting. It's one of the most original movies I think I've ever seen. um it's still one of the best movies. It's still one of my favorite movies. And so Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction. It goes back and forth as to whether that movie or Jackie Brown I consider my best Quentin Tarantino or favorite, because Jackie Brown is phenomenal in its own right. But in the end, I mean, Pulp Fiction wins out for me. So the third of our 1994 films on this list is Tim Burton's Ed Wood. And admittedly, the reason this is on there is it's a movie that I loved when I first saw it, but the reason I love it as much as I do now, it came much later. It came much later when I had started trying to make films for myself, make short films of my own, and Ed Wood and the way Tim Burton tells his story in this movie is very inspiring. Even though he is had no discernible talent whatsoever as a filmmaker, it's hard not to admire Ed Wood for the courage he had in trying to make his movies anyway. And that's one of the things that I think stands out about Ed Wood and the way Burton tells his story in general. And it's like I've ever since then, and especially even though, and I've never seen at the time when I saw Plan 9 from Outer Space, Glen or Glenda, Bar of the Monster, it was, first of all, it was fun watching those movies after the fact, so I could sort of like point to, oh hey, that they did that, they showed that scene in Ed Wood. But I will never consider Ed Wood the worst filmmaker of all time. First of all, I've seen way too much Mystery Science Theater 3000, which we'll get to later. But more than that, I love the passion that he brought to his films, and it's like I do believe that was probably very genuine, and not necessarily just something that Tim Burton and the writers brought to the character. I think it's something that was probably pretty genuine in Ed Wood. Because honestly, I mean, there's a lot of love in his movies. So I mean, the fact that um, I have a hard time making fun of him as a filmmaker, calling him and thinking he's a bad filmmaker. I mean, yes, he was a bad filmmaker. He's hardly the worst though. But I do, the affection that you see in those films goes a long way to redeeming them. And that one I didn't see in theaters. I did see it after the Oscars though, and loved Martin Landau's performance. And I mean, there are so many great performances in that, but Tim Burton's Ed Wood closes out the trilogy of 1994 movies that have really helped shape me over the years. So the next film is from 1995. It's Mel Gibson's Braveheart. And this is because of how because of the drastic change in reputation Mel Gibson has had over the years. It's tough to. Well, it's not tough. I tend to really subscribe to being trying to separate the art from the artist. Um, and Braveheart is a movie that I've just really always loved from the first time my mother and I saw it an advanced screening in 1995. It really just was such a thrilling movie to watch. It was such an epic movie to watch. The way the storytelling was done, it was just wonderful. The performances were wonderful. I can see more of its flaws now the more I watch it, but it's still a story. It's still a story that resonates with me, and that's a big tribute to what Mel Gibson brought to it as a storyteller. More so than anything else, though, a big part of the reason this film is on here, other than the fact that it's still one of my favorite movies of all time, is the fact that James Horner's score for Braveheart uh, is the score that inspired me into doing film music on my own. And it's the score that I listened to, and I by this point I had already really gotten into film music as a genre, but James Horner's score is the moment where I'm like, wow, I really wish I could write something like that. And that's what inspired me to want to compose my own music. And so when I got into college, when I started going to Georgia State, I mean, I eventually did start writing my own music, and Braveheart was one of the films that inspired me, and one of the scores that inspired me to do so. Um, Next up is a, a admittedly it's a bit of a cheat, but it is Jim Allen's 1996 Mystery Science Theater 3000, the movie. Uh, this is obviously an adaptation of the cult TV series Mystery Science Theater 3000, where a guy and two robots make fun of cheesy movies. Um, One of the things that I'm using, apart from the fact that I do love the movie on its own, I'm using the movie here to illustrate the impact, the personal impact on me that MST3K has had on me as a film critic. And I feel like because of Mystery Science Theater, because of Riff Track, Cinemac, Titanic, I I have a greater appreciation for filmmaking, for understanding the flaws of filmmaking, for seeing the good qualities of filmmaking. I'm somebody who I'm much more interested in what movie does right than just trashing it if so much of it doesn't go right. And I think a lot of that comes from Mystery Science Theater 3000. It really shows that can have you can make fun of a movie, but not be cruel about movie. I mean, be able to appreciate filmmaking on an artistic level while also lampooning people who don't do it very well. And so that's a big part of the reason that Mystery Science Theater 3000, the movie, is on this list. Next up is probably my favorite movie that nobody else really knows about, and that is Dan Ireland's The Whole Wide World. It's based on a book about a relationship that the author of the book, Novelyn Price Ellis, had when she was younger with Robert E. Howard, who was the creator of Conan the Barbarian. Novelin and Robert are played by Renee Zellweger and Vincent D'Onofrio, respectively. This is a movie, and it's interesting because when I first got into the dorms at college, they had cable. It was relatively basic cable. Um, they had this one channel, and I don't remember what the name of it is, but it went away relatively quickly, unfortunately. This one channel just had nothing but movie trailers on here. And I saw the trailer for The Whole Wide World on there. That's where I saw it because it had already played at Sundance. Um, but I didn't see it until I saw it at the uh, cinema at on Georgia State's campus at the time, and that's how I saw a lot of movies for the first time. And The Whole Wide World was one of them, and it was just a it's a really sweet and loving story about not even just a romantic relationship. There is obviously tension is a possible romantic relationship between Robert and Novelin, but a friendship between these two people who look at creativity differently. One who's a writer, very much an imagination, somebody who has an imagination and tells strong stories, and somebody who looks at reality and is interested more in reality and appreciates stories, where somebody who in Robert's case has a great storytelling imagination but who sees uh, everything wrong in reality, and the the tension between those two worldviews is one of the things that make a relationship between Novelin and Robert Howard unsustainable, but it's also one of the things that makes this movie so unforgettable for me. And D'Onofrio and Zellweger are absolutely amazing. They're probably some of the best work either actor's done, and it's a really beautiful film. If you can find it, I wholeheartedly recommend it. It's The Whole Wide World. Unfortunately, it's not better known. I wish it were because it's such a great movie. Um, and it's one of my all time favorite movies. Quite frankly, it's one of my 10 favorite movies. I think, just because of the fact that it just tells this amazing story of creativity and the tumultuous mind of an artist. And there have been times where I've identified very much with Robert as a creative person. Um, and I still do to a certain extent. And I appreciate the relationship he has with Novlin and the fact that she is as good a friend to him as anybody could be under those circumstances. And that's something that's really meant a lot to me with friends of mine, female friends of mine in particular, especially when I was going through deep bouts of depression and stress and anxiety in my earlier years. So Dan Ireland's The Whole Wide World continues to inspire me now. Up next is Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. And this was re released in 1996. Unfortunately, I missed it in theaters. I really hate that I missed it in theaters. But I saw it for the first time when it came out on video. And when the restored version came out on video. And it immediately became one of the greatest movies I'd ever seen. And it is, for me, the best movie ever made. Not just from Hitchcock, but in general. It's amazing. It's amazing, multi-layered piece of storytelling from Hitchcock. And one of the boldest things he's ever done as a filmmaker was by letting everybody in on the secret of Judy's identity. Judy, played by the amazing Kim Novak, before when she is found by Scotty, played by Jimmy Stewart, and he finds himself drawn to her because of the fact that she reminds him of this woman, of the woman Madeline that he loved and uh, feels responsible for her death. Bernard Herrmann's score is unbelievable. It's haunting. It's beautiful. Just it's one of the most important pieces of film music ever in terms of not just individual craft, but just as the way it brings the story together is just unreal and just one of the finest pieces of film music ever, in my opinion. And Hitchcock's storytelling is so confident, it's so nakedly personal. I mean, it's something that people only after he passed away identified in Vertigo, but it is plain as day just how much this movie meant to him and just what he was laying people in on as far as himself. And so Hitchcock's Vertigo is something that stands out to me as one of easily one of the most significant pieces of filmmaking in my life, just because of the fact a big part of it is because of the fact that it is the best film I've ever seen, but another part of it is just because of the fact that it it is an example of how performance and writing and music and visuals just really can come together into a truly rapturous cinematic work. Um, and with that in mind, we actually go into a slightly different direction, but a movie that I do feel like holds a lot of the same traits in Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker. This is a movie that actually I was led to because of The Crow. A video review of The Crow mentioned Stalker in terms of a possible influence on the some of the visual parts of the film. And so after that, I was interested, and I didn't get a chance to see the movie because the video review came out in '94. I ended up not being able to see it until 1997, which is why I finally found the movie on video. And it was my first instance with Tarkovsky. And most people, even big fans of Tarkovsky, admit that it's probably one of his most difficult films, and that is absolutely true. Um, the Stalker is takes place in a wasteland, post-nuclear wasteland. It doesn't specifically say post-nuclear wasteland, but it is obvious by the end. And it has three people going to a mysterious room in the middle of this wasteland in the hopes of their dreams becoming reality. And it's a very mystical film. It's a very spiritual film. It is a very laborious pace, to say the least. Even as a Tarkovsky fan, even as a fan of the movie, it's impossible to it's impossible to watch this movie without occasionally feeling like, checking the watch. But at the same time, you're still drawn into the visual and music and audible landscape that Tarkovsky brought to the film. If I know there's some reading on Stalker that's fascinating. If you're interested, if you've ever seen the film and you're interested in reading more about the film, that you don't really, if you don't really know a lot about the film, I know it just came out on Criterion, and I cannot wait to get that for myself on Blu-ray. But Stalker's a movie. It's a movie that requires patience, but also rewards patience. It's not the first movie on this list that will that applies to, but at the same time, It's also it's a film that will definitely challenge viewers as well as reward them. I feel like. Next up is from 1997. It's John Woo's Face Off. Um, and this is probably my favorite pure action movie of all time. It was it's easily the best film John Woo ever made in America. It is comparable, I think, to his best work in Hong Kong. John Travolta and Nicolas Cage go as over the top as I feel like they've ever gone as performers, and I feel like they accomplish exactly what they wanted to accomplish in doing so. And it's just a brilliant movie to watch in that respect. Um, it's a lot of fun. It's got some great comedy, great outrageous, over the top action, humor, character work again by Travolta and Cage, and it's a movie that my mom and I saw opening night, and I was really pumped for this movie when it first came out because of the fact that I'd become a big John Woo fan after Broken Arrow and before Face Off. I'd started to see his Hong Kong work and started to appreciate his Hong Kong work. So I was all in on Woo. And Face Off rewarded that, and I found myself crying. And I basically said, "Damn you, John Woo," at the end of the movie because of how much it affected me on a personal level. And it's just such it's it's the best of what Hollywood can be as far as adventurous filmmaking, as far as big budget filmmaking, as far as just committing and going for broke on a movie. And it's one of the most absurd movies to ever come out during the summer. And that was a weird summer too, because of the fact that you had Richard Donner's Conspiracy Theory, which is kind of out of character for him, but you also had Luc Besson's Fifth Element, which I actually just watched again last night. And there were some very unusual in Robert Zemeckis's Contact. A lot of really adventurous movies that came out that summer, and Face Off was probably the best one of them. Although all of them certainly had their merits. Um, Up next is Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ. Again, this is approximately the order in which I saw those movies. Um, like Schindler's List, Last Temptation of Christ didn't really have the full impact on me until later. I saw it around this time. I really liked it. I thought it was interesting. I was just getting into Scorsese's work, and it was a compelling film. It was fun. It was an interesting film to watch. It wasn't until I started watching it again in my 20s, mid to late 20s, and then early 30s that I really considered the emotional impact and the spiritual impact that that film had on me. Um, I'm somebody who is not specifically religious. I consider myself spiritual but not religious, even though I was raised Presbyterian to a certain degree. Um, and I have had a very up and down relationship with organized religion over the years. I do think Last Temptation of Christ is a movie that kind of helped me reconcile my feelings on religion and to see that there was very much some positive in religion at a time where I was feeling very bitter about the idea of organized religion because of political things I had seen. And I think Last Temptation, along with other films, but especially Last Temptation, it's my favorite religiously themed film of all time. It's one of the best Scorsese films. Um, it really it made me recognize something unique about the story of Christ that I never really got from religion. To be fair, I mean, I wasn't like the most devout religious person when it came to going to church, and I still am not, but it it gave me a lot to think about in terms of religion, in terms of the story of Jesus, in terms of the way that Jesus's story can be interpreted. And the the interesting thing is, while I'm aware that it's not based on the gospel, I nonetheless feel like Last Temptation of Christ, um, this is a this is the Jesus as portrayed by Willem Dafoe and realized by Scorsese and his collaborators in this film is one that I can really get behind and feel like there's something there's something special about this story, and it's the fact that it emphasizes the human aspect of Jesus as as well as the divine, and the fact that those two aspects of him, parts of his being coexist, and the importance of them coexisting. I mean, that's something that really hits home with Last Temptation, and Martin Scorsese's film moves me still 20 years, roughly 20 years or so after I saw it. Next up on the list, we have two movies by Stanley Kubrick. They are 2001: A Space Odyssey and The Shining. 2001: A Space Odyssey, I loved it when I first saw it. I didn't completely understand it, but I loved it nonetheless. This is one of the most inspiring movies I've ever seen as a composer. The way that Kubrick uses sound and the classical music in this film is nothing short of remarkable. I have listened to Alex North's score, which is very good. Both the soundtrack that is presently on the film, as well as Alex North's soundtrack, inspired my own creative endeavor in doing my own alternative soundtrack to 2001, which I started in 2001, but I did not finish until 2010, oddly enough, called Beyond the Infinite, and that is available online on iTunes and other outlets. This is the high water mark for science fiction, flat out, and it is just a great piece of science fiction, of intelligent science fiction, and so it goes without saying that 2001: Space Odyssey was going to be on this list. The Shining was not a movie that resonated with me quite as much when I first saw it in roughly 1997, 1998. But I kept coming back to it and coming back to it and coming back to it, and it is my favorite horror movie of all time. And a lot of the same reasons that 2001 is such a masterpiece, the way Kubrick uses the camera, the way Kubrick uses images to tell the story, the way he uses music, the way he uses sound. Not so much the performances, although the performances by Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, and Danny Lloyd are absolutely phenomenal in this movie. This is another movie that, from a musical standpoint, has inspired me a great deal. And when I do watch horror movies, every October, a lot of Octobers, I've been inspired to write my own music because of what I've seen. And The Shining is one of those films that has inspired me more often than not. Going to 1998, and we have Alex Proyas's Dark City. Because of my love of The Crow, this was a movie that I was looking forward to almost from the second I first heard about it, because of the fact that I was such a Proyas fan after The Crow. And when I went to go see it opening day, and I'd read Roger Ebert's review of it, got really excited about it, ran to go see it after classes opening day, and absolutely loved it. I thought it was a fantastic movie, and it's still one of the great science fiction films, not just of the modern era, but also of all time, in the way it deals with the personal stories um, of John Murdoch, played by Rufus Sewell, his wife Emma, William Hurt, Kiefer Sutherland. I never had I at the time I never really had a big issue with the narration that happens at the beginning, like other people did. But having seen the director's cut, I definitely understand it. It holds up extremely well without that narration, and I mean, part of it could be because of the fact that I've seen it so much with the narration and I understand what's going on. But the fact of the matter is, it's uh, it's just a fine piece of storytelling in general, and the visuals are unbelievable. The music is terrific. Um, it's it's the movie that I felt like The Matrix wasn't when that movie came out a year later. And Alex Proyas's Dark City definitely had to be on here because it was one of those movies that I was just like Face Off. Uh, I was really anxious to see because of my experiences with the filmmaker previously. Next up, we have Saving Private Ryan by Steven Spielberg. Um, this movie, uh, I remember having just such an overwhelming emotional experience when I first came out. I saw it by myself because my dad really wasn't into movies, and I think he was at the gun club or something like that. And my mom was up in Ohio, but the four of us, uh, including my grandfather, did go to see this around the time he came down for my birthday that year, and really struck a chord with him and my father. I believe it was the last movie my father saw in theaters. Um, and I mean, he wasn't much of a moviegoer, but the film just really hit home with them in a positive manner in terms of the way it dealt with war and the morality of war. Um, and both of them were veterans. My dad in Vietnam, my grandfather in World War II. I've never had a problem with the bookends. I feel like the bookends really work extremely well. As great as the battle scenes are, I do feel like the best scene in the movie still is the scene when at the beginning when we see the clerk who is doing the letters to the family to let them know that their uh, family members have died, and she realizes, oh hey, this, oh, what's going on with the Ryan family, and it's a scene that stuck out when I first saw it, and it's a scene that continues to resonate when I watch it now, and just the way that Spielberg doesn't hit anything on the head, but just lets it unfold quietly and confidently. It's one of the things that I really love about the film. Next up is Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr., which I know I saw around this time. This is my favorite movie of all time, and it is the reason it's my favorite movie of all time, other than the fact that it's very funny, it's very terrific Buster Keaton filmmaking, is the fact that it's also a story that means a lot to me because of the fact that it is about a projectionist who dreams himself into the movie that he's showing. And for the hopeless romantic, because the projectionist, played by Keaton, has just had his loved one jilt him after he's been framed for stealing a watch. Um, there's a lot of things that really spoke to me over the years watching it, and still speak to me as somebody who did projection as well and was always interested in that part of movie watching. And so Sherlock Jr. really spoke to me when I would do it, when I would watch it over the years. Other than the fact that it's just a really entertaining movie, it's a really fun movie, and so that is the reason it's my favorite movie of all time, is because of that personal connection to the story, which is inherently silly and kind of loopy. It's still something that strikes a chord with me, and that is something that not a lot of silent films have done, and certainly few have done it as well or as effectively as Sherlock Jr. Up next, we have Trey Parker's South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. And this seems like an odd film for me to choose because while I've watched South Park over the years, I haven't been a hardcore fan of it for a long time. Um, but the fact of the matter is, it's like this film, as a critic, as somebody who is interested in the film industry, as somebody who watches closely the film industry, you can see the inherent absurdity of the film industry and what it deems appropriate for certain movies and what it doesn't deem appropriate come through in the insanity that is Trey Parker's film. And the musical numbers are just brilliant. The social commentary is brilliant. I remember I did work at a movie theater. I was an usher, and it's like we were very specific. Oh, it's like we had to make sure that nobody got into this R-rated movie, and you had to check IDs. I got checked. I with my ID, and I was 21 years old at the time. Um, but and then when a couple weeks later, like American Pie came out, and then Eyes Wide Shut, it's like, oh, go ahead, go on it. That's fine. We're not going to check your ID. It was specifically for this one, and I think a lot of it was because of the attention that this movie put on the MPAA and the absurdity of the movie rating system that we have in America, and which still baffles people overseas, and believe me, it baffles us as well. Up next is Milos Forman's Amadeus, and this was a late entry to this list. I first, even though I had heard about the movie, I hadn't seen it until a friend of mine from college recommended it, and I saw it, and it was one of those things where sort of like uh, Schindler's List and The Shining and other movies on this list, the impact on me would come afterwards. It was a movie that I greatly admired. I thought was terrific filmmaking. Thought was a terrifically entertaining film, but the story of the creative artist and the story of a brilliant artist against a an establishment that didn't understand them, and the rivalry between Mozart and Salieri in the film didn't really the overall impact of that did not hit me until years later after I'd really started to grow creatively as an artist as well, and somebody who takes art very seriously and tries to do the very best I can. Um, it's something that it's something that speaks to me on that level. It's great filmmaking in general, to be sure, but it's also something that uh, you see the self destruction of creativity as well, and of the creative individual as well, in both Mozart and Salieri, because in their own ways they're self-destructing themselves. Mozart with his rebellious and reckless nature, Salieri because of his obsession with Mozart and how great he is compared to how mediocre Salieri is. And that's one of the things that really sticks out to me over the years about Amadeus. Next up is Edward Norton's Keeping the Faith. And this movie is on here for a few reasons. The primary reason is because it was very much a comfort food movie for me the summer my grandfather died. My mom and I had gone to see it, and we enjoyed it. It was a fun movie. Before I went up to Ohio and went to visit my grandfather and be around him as he was going through treatment for cancer. And this was a movie I went to often. The first time we were up there, I saw it, I think, 7 times total in the theater, and 6 of those times I was up in Ohio. It was a movie that just really that that title says so much, keeping the faith, and that's something that I really took to heart. Not from a spiritual standpoint, not from a religious standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint, and it's something that I really needed to see these people in a tricky situation, a difficult situation that tests them emotionally, and see how they react. And the performances are good. Edward Norton does a very good job with the movie. But there's always been something deeper when it comes to that movie, and something that really spoke to me when I was going through that with my grandfather. And then later, it sort of morphed into it kind of morphed into a reflection of how I viewed relationships, how I viewed dating, how I wanted to be in a relationship at the time. And it's something that it was a film that really was important to me when it came to well, this is sort of what I want in a relationship. I mean, my interests grew and expanded the more I grew, the more I matured as an individual, but ultimately just the difficulty of being in love at times was something that really resonated with me about this film. That is Edward Norton's Keeping the Faith. Up next, we have another Spielberg film. It's the 4th one on this list, and I mean, he is my favorite filmmaker, so it actually does kind of make sense that he's on here so much. It is AI, Artificial Intelligence. Just like the previous film was a good sort of comfort food for me when my grandfather was sick and eventually passed. AI, Artificial Intelligence was a movie, especially at the end, where you have David being able to have one more day with Monica, his mother. When I first saw that with my mom and my friends Ron, Dave, and Mike, that sequence in particular, even though a lot of people criticize Spielberg for it, I loved it because of the fact that it it felt like that was the type of thing that I felt like I wanted. I felt like I was sort of having that moment with my grandfather at the time, and I felt like that was something that was part of my grieving process. That was something that I needed to see to sort of go through and progress my grieving process. Uh, the movie itself it's flawed, but it's nonetheless it's just as good a science fiction movie as 2001 Stalker, and I've connected the three at times in terms of themes, in terms of the way they use images, the way they use music, the way they tell broad personal and spiritual stories um, in varying ways of of storytelling, of scope, and just how there's. I feel like those three films, there's a lot of connective thread, and it's not easy to see. But I mean, if you're as familiar with those films as I am, I mean, you do start to see that there could be some validity to seeing things that way. Next up, this is the 30th film on this list, is another film by Tarkovsky. It is Andrei Rublev, his biopic about the famed Russian icon painter, although most people will admit that it's not actually directly based on specific events of his life. I mean, there are some biographical moments in the film, but the fact of the matter is, it's ultimately about Russian history and a particular point of Russian history, and how the artist in the type of situation that Rublev finds himself reacts to that situation. And this was one of the last films I think I had seen of Tarkovsky's, if not the last one, as far as his feature films. And even though it's missing a lot of the subtitles, and even though it can be sometimes, like all of his films, a little laborious to watch, um, it's nonetheless a fascinating movie to watch. And as an artist, like a lot of these films, there's a certain part of that really speaks to me in terms of the way Tarkovsky presents Rublev and the crises of faith in his art and in religion that he has during some of these key moments in Russian history that Tarkovsky is illuminating. And the movie is just, the more you watch it, the more you get sucked into it, and the more it resonates with you, which is the case with pretty much every Tarkovsky film. Um, there are so many Tarkovsky films that it's like I've seen the first time, they were good, I appreciated them, but at the same time, it wasn't until afterwards, the more I watched them, the more I thought about them, that they really uh, did something significant that stayed with me. Continuing on with the list, we come up to 2002 and Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine. This is where I sort of let the cat out of the bag of my political affiliations, but the fact of the matter is, it's like when I thought about this movie, it really did have to be included because of how important of a movie it was for me at the time, and it still is. 15 years later, as far as how we as society view guns, we as a country view guns, and we as and the insanity that we sort of have around gun culture in America. And it's, yes, I understand there's a lot of moments where more fibs with the things they stages, the events they stages, like getting the gun from the bank. But the fact of the matter is, it's nonetheless emotionally true when it comes to this this country and gun violence in a way that still rings true now, unfortunately. As much as it would have been nice to see significant change after this movie, it was not meant to be. And really, things have kind of gotten worse in a way. Um, so that's Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine, which haunted me at the time and still haunts me, as well as entertains me. Next up is Spike Jonze' adaptation, and this is another film about a creative artist um, who is in the middle of a crisis of conscience when it comes to his art and a crisis of creativity. It's inspired by Charlie Kaufman's attempts to adapt the Orchid Thief, and such a beautifully inventive movie. It's one of Nick Cage's best performances, if not his best performance. Meryl Streep is fantastic in it. Chris Cooper is fantastic in it. Um, the movie really says so much about the creative process and the writing process in general. Um, that and how hamstrung people can get uh, when the ideas just aren't flowing the way that you would hope that they are. Um, and Spike Jonze and Charlie Kaufman with this and being John Malkovich were just a match made in heaven as far as director and writer. And it's a shame they haven't really done anything else since. But nonetheless, this film still sticks with me to this day. Is Spike Jonze adaptation. Coming up is this is actually the last sort of classic movie on this list. It is Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Sort of like 2001, this is very much a benchmark for a specific genre for me, in this case, the Western. I love the imagination Leone has in telling it. I love the scope of it. I love the performances. And of course, I love the music by Ennio Morricone, which has been so inspirational to me over the years. And after this movie in particular, as well as getting into some of his other spaghetti western music, I wrote my own sort of musical western, um, you know, through sort of in the alternative soundtrack vein that Beyond the Infinite in 2001 took on, Sonic Visions of a New Old West, uh, sort of does is sort of along the same lines, and it's one of those things where um, the music is just so inspiring. It's so much fun to listen to. It's so creative and imaginative, and just such a bold uh, test of a genre. And that's and I think it's the fact that this is sort of like the 2001 of westerns in many ways that sort of really makes it resonate with me more than other westerns. But it's the soundtrack in particular that really stands out with this film, which is Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Up next is Richard Linklater's Before Sunset, and this was a late choice. I was originally going to do Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is an amazing movie in its own right. But Before Sunset is the one that really resonated with me. More. Both of them are fantastic movies, but in terms of the point in my life that I was in, my wife is sticking her tongue out me while she should be watching her Twilight movie. Um, and now I have completely lost my train of thought here as she's
Yeah, he has
walking
to
up.
start over. Ha ha ha
Wow. How do you feel about that, Bendu? That is one of our cats, Bendu. I may just leave this in because this is actually kind of funny. Returning to the list after my wife interrupted me last time with one of our cats, we have Richard Linklater's Before Sunset. Like I mentioned earlier, I was originally going to put Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind on here, which was a fantastic movie. But the truth of the matter is, Before Sunset just resonated with me a lot stronger at that point in my life. I mean, both films are terrific films. Both films are terrific love stories. Um, but there's something about Jesse and Celine, played by Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, in the Before movies that just resonates with me a lot stronger. And at the time, Before Sunset really spoke to me. And it's it's a film that was probably my one of my favorite movies of the year that year, if not my favorite movie of the year. Um, Not sure if I would necessarily say that now, but I mean it's definitely my favorite love story of the year, and just the way that it handles the tension of them seeing each other for the first time in 9 years, and what's going on with their lives, and all of that just is really powerful to me. That was Richard Linklater's Before Sunset. Next up is a little bit of a different choice, but the fact of the matter is, it's a movie that really helped me out through a difficult time when I was first starting to understand my issues with anxiety and depression, and it is Chris Columbus's adaptation of Jonathan Larson's Broadway smash Rent. Um, I'd never seen, or I wasn't really familiar with the Broadway musical. I'd heard of it before, but this was the when I saw it in theater, the movie in theaters. It was the first time I had really seen and heard the music before, and I really loved it. And it's just such a flashpoint for a particular time in New York City, but it's also just a really great story of a lot of people who are going through specifically difficult times in their lives, and trying to find inspiration wherever they can, and that's a story that really spoke to me when it came out, and it still speaks to me now. Um, it's Chris Columbus's Rent, and I will say, to sort of go along with 2001 and Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, as far as being inspirations to me, creatively speaking. Um, After my grandfather died, I'd started to write a piece of music that would sort of look at my the emotional journey I went on after he passed away, and I was having a hard time with the ending of it as I was working around this time. And one day I was in the car. It was a time where I was going through a really depressed era time and really anxious time in my life. And I listened, the song Will I was playing when I was driving into work to do something one day. And I just had this eureka moment, and that really inspired me to conclude the piece, and the inspired the conclusion of the piece, and so that was an interesting little benefit of watching the movie and hearing the music at the time that came out, and how it helped me in my own creative path. Up next is one of the few the only sequel that we have here, and or no, sorry, one of two sequels we have on here. But the fact of the matter is, and it's probably going to be an interesting one for a lot of people, but for me, it made all the sense in the world to include Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3. Uh, Most people did not like this film, and I completely understand it from a storytelling standpoint as a Spider-Man fan and what have you. But it's probably my favorite of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, and maybe even the Spider-Man movies in general at this point. Even though Spider-Man: Homecoming was really good, um, and the reason for that is even though comic book fans are disappointed with the way they did the Venom storyline in this, I love it because of the fact that this was a point in my life, sort of like Rent, where I was really starting to understand my struggles with anxiety and stress and depression more often than not, more often than I had earlier in my life, and I was working on getting my way out of it. And Spider-Man 3 was a pretty good reflection of that, and that's something that really I identified with in this film more so than other people. And so this was a big movie for me to have uh, to have in my life at this time, and it's an example of, as we'll see in a couple of other movies as we close out this list, that the older I've gotten, especially, and by that point when Spider-Man 3 came out, I was about to turn 30, and that was part, a big time in my life for working out a lot of things I hadn't really worked out before. And so Spider-Man 3 was a big part of that. And so even though it's not really considered one of the better Spider-Man movies by a lot of fans, it's always had very specific uh, personal meaning to me. Up next is the only Pixar movie on here. There are a few others I could have chosen, but the one in particular that stands out to me is Pete Docter's Up from 2009. Um, I've talked a lot about my grandfather passing away in this podcast, and this is sort of going to close out that chapter because Up is a great movie. It's one of Pixar's very finest movies, but there was very specific emotional component for me that really just um, made this movie head and shoulders above pretty much anything else Pixar's ever done for me. And that's the fact that Carl Fredricksen, the Ed Asner character, um, reminds me a lot of my grandfather. And he was when my grandfather's wife passed away. Um, my grandfather started to travel the world, and he would always, when he would come to visit, he would always tell us about his travels and about the times they had on them. He would share pictures they would take and all that stuff. It was really fantastic. Even though it was something that I think I didn't appreciate until he passed away as much as I should have. Um, for somebody who was in Boy Scouts, you know, the character, the kid in Up, I saw a lot of myself in that kid, and so I had this personal experience watching Up the first time where, even though, I mean, it felt like my grandfather was in the theater next to me watching this movie as well, and that was something that really it made the movie even more special than it already is, and the fact that this old man who spent the last year who is spending his twilight years traveling the world, getting in adventures, not Indiana Jones type of adventures like in Up, but doing something he'd always wanted to do, uh, inspired by the grief of losing his wife, and having this scout tag along. It felt like that my grandfather and I finally were able to share an adventure together, and that's that's the personal component to Up that has always been really significant for me, and it's the reason that I think above any other Pixar movie, that will always be my personal favorite for a lot of reasons, but in particular that reason. So, is Pete Docter's Up. Next up is 2011's Martin Scorsese film Hugo, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. I think it's number 3 on the list after Sherlock Jr. and The Crow. Um, Hugo shares a lot in common with Sherlock Jr. in terms of why it resonates. It's about old Hollywood. It's about the love and romance of cinema. Is about the imagination of cinema. It's one of the best 3D movies ever, especially in the live action realm. But also just the impact that movies can have on somebody, and that's something that really I identify with quite a bit in the character of Hugo Cabret, and the fact that he's trying to find his place in the world after these tragic moments of his life, and that reminds me a lot of my own life in terms of when I've had struggles, when I've had difficulties trying to figure out what my purpose in life is. And that's been something of a common refrain to a certain extent the past 10 years of my life, but it's something that I always find myself striving for is, well, what is my identity? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? Not completely sure, but Hugo is a movie that, like Up, and Rent and Spider-Man 3 and Before Sunset, like the last 4 movies on this list, it's the personal component, the emotions that come up during the movie, even more so than the movie itself, that have really uh, led me to appreciate the movie as much as I do and to rate it as highly as I do. And Martin Scorsese's a great filmmaker in that respect, but Hugo, along with Last Temptation of Christ, are 2 films that really speak to me more than probably any of his other films have. We're coming up on the last 2 here. The first one is 2012's Cloud Atlas from the Wachowskis and Tom Tykwer. It is the first time I saw it. My mom and I saw it. I thought it was a fantastic movie coming out of the gate. It was complicated, which was the nature of the beast with so many different storylines going on. But it stuck with me. The scope of the movie stuck with me. The emotions that the movie and the quick stories brought up in me stuck with me. And then the more I saw it when it came out on home video and Blu-ray and DVD, it just really sunk into the ideas of it, the ideas of what we, of the importance of our legacy and the importance of what we do in this life, um, and how that affects other people, how that affects the world in general. That's something that really hit home for me when I was watching Cloud Atlas. And the more and more I would watch Cloud Atlas, and it does help that it's got one of the greatest film scores I think I've ever heard. Um, and it's just such a beautiful movie. It's such an original movie and an original vision, and the way that the Wachowskis and Taika uh, cast the same actors in different roles in each of the different stories, and how one character identifies with another, and how Tom Hanks's characters all um, feed into one another, how Halle Berry's characters feed into one another, Jim Sturgis's characters, so on and so forth. And it's just such an amazing movie. It's one of the best movies I've ever seen, and I think it's a movie that will justly be recognized. The more it is, the longer it has, the more people start to recognize it. The more people will realize that it is one of the great movies of the modern era. That is Cloud Atlas. Finally, we are going to close with a another franchise that means a lot to me, uh, much like Star Wars does. This one on a much more personal level. It is How to Train Your Dragon 2 from 2014. Um, much like Up, this movie came about at an important time of grieving in my life. And help me reconcile some feelings with a deep loss that I just felt with my father passing away about 8 months previous. Um, and I did not expect that. I loved the first How to Train Your Dragon when it came out, but I mean, I didn't really have a personal connection to it. When I saw the second one, and rewatched the first one in light of my father's passing, it really shot into focus a completely different way of looking at these movies in terms of a son who has a hard time. First, as a son who has a hard time seeing a lot of himself of his father in him, and then who has to take up the mantle unexpectedly when something happens, and the responsibility that goes into that. And it was something that really just hit me like a ton of bricks when I saw the second film at the time I had. And it was 8 months after my dad died, and it was just that sense of responsibility that need to step up and to really figure out who you are was important to understand for me personally at that time. And it's something that seeing it, it's amazing that Up and How to Train Your Dragon 2 are like, they're both family films, they're both animated films, but they've probably had strong and emotional connection to me in as much of an emotional impact on me as an individual, as somebody who loves movies, and as somebody who finds themselves endlessly recognizing parts of myself within movies. Having that as part of my identity is, and having these two films really hit home in unexpected ways for me makes them very special to me. And so it would be difficult to close this podcast out with anything other than How to Train Your Dragon 2. Well, that's it. So that is the list of 40 films that shaped my first 40 years. I could have gone on. There were a lot of films that some that I already mentioned here that I did not go into, that I could have added, that I could have maybe some I could subtracted. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, it's like these were the ones that stood out to me as ones that mean more to me on a personal manner than pretty much any other films that I've ever seen. And I've seen thousands by this point. Um, and so I hope you enjoyed this list. I originally wanted to have this done by my birthday, but unfortunately, certain things came up that just that was not able to be done. But better late than never. And this is something that I really did want to do, and I hope you got a lot out of it. I got a lot out of talking about these movies. I hope you enjoy these movies. I hope you seek out these movies if you haven't seen them, and I hope that you join us next time. This is Brian Scuttle with the Sonic Cinema podcast. I hope to have more interviews. I hope to have more shared commentaries with friends coming up. I'm not going to do an end of the summer uh, summary this year as far as the summer movies, just because I haven't seen a whole lot. I am going to talk about this year at some point, movie wise. It's been an interesting year. I am going to do another podcast on Dragon Con with that coming in the next couple weeks. I'm definitely going to do a follow up podcast about that. Um, I wanted to be more active with the podcast this summer, but unfortunately, it just wasn't meant to be. Hopefully, with the fall, and things are starting to get a little bit more back to normal after some changes. So hopefully I'll have more for you, and I hope it'll be something that you guys enjoy. I hope you guys enjoy listening to this, and thank you very much.